Welcome to the Evolved Caveman, where men learn to be successful and happy with your host, Dr. John Schinnerer, as he shares the most impactful ideas and practices for you to get the most from your relationships, your work, and from your life. Now here's Dr. John.
Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of the Evolved Caveman. I am super excited today to have with me Mark Greene. And Mark Greene is an Emmy-winning animator, author, speaker, parent, and senior editor at the Good Men Project. He is the founder of Remaking Manhood, a Facebook community promoting a wider-ranging conversation about masculinity. Mark's articles on masculinity have been shared 500,000 times on social media, with 20 million page views. He has written and spoken about men's issues at Salon, Shriver Report, Huffington Post, HLN, BBC, and the New York Times. Mark is the author of the Little Me Too book for men and Remaking Manhood. He's also the co-author, along with Dr. Saliha Bava, of the Relational Book for Parenting. For more information on Mark's work, you can join his Remaking Manhood community on Facebook. Did I get Saliha's name right?
You did it the way I used to do it when I first met her. Her pronunciation is Saliha.
Different accent. Okay.
Yeah. It's an equal accent on all three. And when I was first dating her, I was literally like, please don't screw this up. And I screwed it up because I was worried about screwing it up. So it took me a little while, but now her name is Saliha Bava. She is a couple and family therapist. She teaches at the graduate level at Mercy College, and everything that I've arrived at in terms of my work and writing and ideas and whatnot have been born out of the conversation with her. So,
well, and so here's the book, and I got to say, I got this book and I fell in love with it. So thank you very much for being on the podcast. So let's dive into it. Let's talk a little bit about man box culture, and if you could start out sort of talking about how man box culture differs from masculinity, I think that might be a good place to begin.
Good. Well, in the 1980s, a guy named Paul Kivel, working with the Oakland Men's Project, went out and started asking boys at the various middle and high schools in the Oakland area, what does it mean to be a man? And what he discovered over the course of a number of years of doing this work and at an even wider and wider ranging of high schools was that the rules for being a man were fairly simple. And he ultimately ended up drawing a box and putting the rules inside that box. And the rules are, when you talk about the rules of man box culture, these things resonate for us because we sort of remember when we first figured these rules out, and many of them might seem to be unspoken, but they're pretty clear, actually. One is men don't show their emotions. Another is that men are tough, men are leaders, men always have the final word, men always get the girl, men care about sports and sports conversations. But these sort of rules have a darker side because they tend to play out in dominant ways. So when you're a leader because you dominate everyone else. When you're getting the girls, it's because you're aggressive and dominating in your behavior sexually and socially. But man box culture, as originally framed by Paul Kivel, I went and did some of this work in a New York high school within the last couple of years, and the same answers came up. I asked the question, they gave the same answers. And so that means that for 45 or 50 years, the framework for how we teach boys about masculinity really hasn't changed much. And I make a very, very consistent and ongoing effort to talk about culture of masculinity, our dominant culture of masculinity versus our masculinity, because your masculinity and my and the masculinity of any man listening to this podcast, they're all distinctive. They're all different. But the culture that teaches us what men are, that's where we all sort of get corralled and herded into this less diverse performance of manhood. And it's actually extremely conforming at some point. We're all
I think that distinction to me is very important, and thank you for making it, because I think it allows us to have the conversation about culture in general, which is less threatening to us men than if we're talking about our individual masculinity and what you may or may not be doing wrong to be masculine enough, which is kind of one of our problems.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. And men, we have to understand that man box culture, that our dominant culture of masculinity is so widespread and so consistently applied that for us, it just looks like life. It just likes the water we swim in, the air we breathe. We as men often struggle to make a distinction between me, my sense of what a man is, what I am, and the culture that actually taught us a whole lot of what we believe. And if we can create a little bit of daylight between me, my identity, and this larger culture, which helped me arrive at the conclusions that led me to believe my identity is this, if we can create some daylight there, then men can begin to ask questions. Well, why do I believe this about myself? Why do I believe I should earn the money but not be a caregiver? Why do I believe I should keep getting more and more and more women in bed? Why do I believe I in order to work on a project, I need to go in with every idea pre-thought out and then convince everyone else to agree with that?
Well, I think, at a deeper level, one of the things that fascinates me about the men that I work with is, what's your goal? What's your long-term? What are the values that are driving it? And I don't think most of us stop to take a look at that, because to me, and I'm biased, I think that happiness is the goal that we're all shooting for. And we're kind of deluded into thinking that by participating in this man box culture, that if we do it well enough, then we're happy.
Oh, yeah. A lot of these mechanisms by which we define manhood are things that we do, right? We make money, we bed women, we win games, we dominate people and control conversations, and we are the guy that runs the company. We are the final word on everything. These are all things that we do. And when you talk about a culture of masculinity in which, okay, so you're going to do it well? Good. All right, so how much money do you make? Well, okay, how much money did you make last week, last month? Well, that's nice. Okay, how much did you make today? And how much are you going to make tomorrow? So it becomes a treadmill where we have to keep proving by what we do. Man box culture doesn't care who we are. It doesn't care who we are individually. It doesn't care who we are when we connect in authentic ways. It doesn't care about our fears or concerns or anxieties. In fact, if we reveal that stuff within the context of man box culture, we get shamed and bullied until we quit. Yeah. So, don't show that stuff. We don't want to see that. So the end result is that you have a culture of doing instead of being, and people are almost inevitably end up running out of steam at some point. I can't, my one-liners stop working with the women. I cannot earn money forever. And God knows, being a tough, masculine guy who can take it, eventually we're going to fall ill. And what's worse is man box culture cuts us off from all of those natural human capacities for connection and relating, which come out of expressing emotionally. I mean, that's how we connect in authentic ways with others. And the end result is that we often find ourselves at odds with people close to us. We end up going through divorces. Things fall apart after a while if you follow the man box rules to their logical.
Yeah, and then I see a lot of men that get to 40 or 50 that succumb to stress or are heavy into drugs and alcohol, porn, prostitutes, because they have no other way, no other outlet. And it's funny, I'll tell a lot of my clients, look, I can effectively eliminate 2/3 of the emotional spectrum for you with 2 phrases. That if you show, when you're growing up, if you show too much fear or sadness, it's stop being such a pussy. And if you show too much excitement, joy, romanticism, love, it's don't be so gay. And if you're smart and you're sensitive and you feel things, it doesn't take a whole lot of times of hearing that before you're like, man, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm just going to bury it. And almost every man I've spoken to, their first strategy is, I'm just going to stop feeling. I'm going to shut down all emotions. And it's not possible, but that's our first attempt, I think.
Right. And the ultimate cost for that is a deep, deep epidemic of social isolation for men.
Yeah. And then we're lousy in relationship. And the women are saying, we're all men that are emotionally aware. In some ways not to be.
Well, they were, and that's the thing that I try to explain whenever I get a chance to be in conversation about men. We aren't what we are because that's the natural state for men. In fact, the natural state for men is a is wildly diverse. Any of us knows that, of the guys if you know them well, you know that each one of them has a set of sort of secret sides, which are very different, very diverse. There should be not a masculinity, but a vast range of masculinities for us, where and they all should be equally valued, so that when we start to come to understand ourselves, we can move toward a performance of masculinity that fits for us. And that would be open and authentic and connecting in the world, instead of this, John Wayne stereotype we're all trying to do and ultimately failing at. The thing that I say to men who are in man box culture is, if these are the things that you think define masculinity, then somewhere out there in the future waiting for you is your failure, because you will ultimately fail. And that, I think we know that intuitively. We understand that I just had this big win today, and it isn't going to mean anything tomorrow because I got to have another win to prove. And so it creates
masculinity is hard fought or hard earned and easily.
Yeah. And that creates a sort of an ongoing anxiety all the time. You're looking over your shoulder to see who's coming up behind you. You're looking around to see if anybody noticed that you had a little moment of doubt. You're doing all these things which are anxiety inducing. And the thing about man box culture that we have to understand is, Paul Kibble went in and he drew that box and he put those sentences of what it means to be a real man. And like you said earlier, if you fail at that, if you show too much excitement or joy, you're a fag. If you show too much fear or anxiety, you're a sissy, you're a girl. So what are the words we use to keep men in the box? What are you, a girl? What are you, a sissy? What are you, a fag? What are you?
I had to from Oakland add bitch to that list. I was like, yeah.
Well, there are much worse words, but ultimately what you end up doing is you strip away. And all human beings are born with an equal set of capacities for connection and relating. You look at any infant, they are connecting already in very powerful, emotionally resonant ways with their parents. But we beat it out of boys, and we beat it out of them daily, beginning when they're 2 to 3 years old and coming forward. As soon as language is operational, we start saying, don't do that, don't do this, don't cry, don't do whatever. But we beat it out of our sons, this ability to connect. And the way we police them, when they do it wrong, we denigrate girls and LGBT people. So LGBTQ community and girls are the way that we denigrate boys. So there's no other way except that boys grow into manhood socially isolated and thinking of those other populations as second-class citizens. So, of course, we harass and abuse women. Naturally, they're...
Well, and I like this idea of masculinity as a negative identity, in that, we're told a lot or taught a lot what not to do, what not to be. Don't appear female, don't appear to be gay. But we're not told a lot of what to do.
Right.
So where do you think we go in terms of a positive masculinity, in terms of what aspects of masculinity would we like to keep? What would we like to add to that?
Right. I often say that we have sort of an ongoing public effort to create affirmations for girls. And what are the affirmations that we talk about for girls, for our daughters? We say, yes, you're pretty and you're cute and you're this and that, but also you're smart, you're a good leader, you're tough, you know how to deal with adversity, all that stuff. These are the affirmations for girls. Now, what does that sound like to you? That sounds like what we tell boys. Okay, so what assumed capacities do girls have? Emotional expression, connection, forming networks, noticing and caring about other people's emotions. If we had a set of affirmations for our sons where we not only said, good, you're tough, you're fast, you're strong, you're a leader, but we also say, hey, I saw that you noticed that emotion in your friend. I saw that you responded to him. That was good. What did you see happening there? And why do you think he was feeling that? That was great work. That was great connecting. I see how you take care of your friendships. That's remarkable. This whole idea that we can have affirmations for our sons around relational intelligence and relational capacities, the capacities by which we maintain and form relationships, would give them the other half of being human we take away from girls half of their capacities in terms of toughness and strength, and we take away from boys half of their naturally human capacities around connection and forming relationships and understanding context and holding uncertainty and connecting across difference and all the things we need to be fully human and to be fully empowered leaders, right?
Yeah, and I've learned a lot from you in a short amount of time. One of the things that I've learned is your use of languaging around these issues. And one of the things that I love is, I think prior to coming across you, prior to meeting you, I used to think of it in terms of kind of balancing masculine and feminine energy, which I think is a really good way to go in general. You kind of reframed that for me as, let's just talk about these as human traits, human abilities, human emotions, which I think is a really good way to go.
Well, the problem I have with masculine and feminine is that it implies a binary. It implies an either or. And people have done a lot of good work about saying, well, we all have the masculine and the feminine within us. But for me, I see nothing inherently feminine about expressing emotionally. I see nothing inherently feminine about caregiving.
Well, I think many of us also have deep judgments about the word masculine or the word feminine, which could keep us from adopting some of those traits or developing.
Right. Well, and also the other thing I really work hard to say is that we're all born with these capacities. They are in us. They are evident. Judy Chu wrote a book called When Boys Become Boys, and she was embedded in a pre-K class for 2 years. She went with these boys and girls, followed these cohorts. And she said that a young boy at age 4 came up to her and said, Mrs. Chu, I'm friends with all the girls, but don't tell, Mike, the head of the boys club, because if he finds out, he'll kick me out of the boys club and I won't have a club. And it's troubling enough that this young man already understood that he could not openly have friendships with girls, which, if boys were free to do that, if girls and boys were friends as they moved up toward early adolescence, they would have the years of trial and error effort to sort of understand the nuances of connecting across gender, across difference, all that stuff. But no, we just cut them off. But what's more troubling about this little boy's story is that he's already tracking the alpha in his cohort, and he's already removing, literally eliminating parts of himself that he understands don't fit the traditional masculine model.
Well, and if you take that out a bit further in time, what I see a lot of is, let's say, high school young adolescent males that have hung out with male friends their whole way coming up, and they were trying to impress their male friends, and then somewhere around 17, 18, 19, 20, they'll meet a girl, get into a relationship. They have very little experience being with or communicating with females. A lot of times these guys will fall in love and marry the first relationship they get into at a very young age, and then, fast forward 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and they're getting a divorce, and they really have no relational skill or ability because they haven't been in a series of relationships, nor have they had female friendships to develop these skills.
Right. It's a fascinating equation. Niobe Way wrote a book called Deep Secrets, and she went to boys coming up, and this speaks to something that you mentioned earlier. She began to interview boys in early adolescence, 13, 14 years of age. She'd say, what does your best friend mean to you? And the boys would speak, all of them would speak like something out of a Harlequin romance. They'd say, I love my best friend. They used the word love unabashedly. And the other thing they all said was, without my best friend, I would go crazy. Then you go forward 3 or 4 years, she interviewed the same boy. She's done hundreds of these interviews over a decade or more. They would say, yeah, my best friend Mike, he lives down the street, but I don't see him that much anymore. He's a great basketball player, no homo. He's a great basketball player. So anytime they compliment one of these friends, they would make it clear that they would use the phrase no homo to make it clear that they're not, having some sort of romantic idea, as if simply complimenting your friend, implies that possibility. And then this other kid said, oh yeah, that friendship's sort of in a crossfade, right? Come to find out that these boys are all doing this thing you described, which is a masculinity of what we are not. And in their case, they're trying to prove they're not little kids, girly, or gay. And for that reason, that message coming at them all the time about wanting and needing close friendships, they are slowly disengaging. And it is at that point that boys' rates of suicide rise to 4 times that of girls. Mm-hmm. So we literally thrive on relationships and would go crazy without them, quote unquote. And yet we are beaten and bullied and shamed into disengaging from those. And then we're pushed. You want a relationship? You want connection? They're pushed toward a female partner who's in no position to manage the level of need that would be created in a human being that's told, forget all your male friendships, just get a girl. Mm-hmm. God forbid he should be gay. That's even more catastrophic. But he's sent to a girl, and they, of course, form a relationship that is entirely too loaded from every possible angle. And these guys sign their own death warrants 20, 30 years down the road because they've bought into this idea that social isolation and deep, meaningful, rich, joyful connection with male friends is a sign that they're somehow not real men.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I'm just putting this together now that it seems like, in high school or college, a lot of these young men get into a primary relationship with a woman and they get too attached too quickly because I believe they have this flood of emotion. Mm-hmm. And, so they feel, wow, I haven't felt this good in years since I was, a child. Mm-hmm. And they also have this connection in terms of conversation.
Yeah.
And I think it's unlike anything we've seen for half our lives at that point. And so we think we're in love, which, sometimes we are, but I would love to see what could happen if we were raised in a relationally intelligent manner.
Right. Well, try this one on for size. We then come to sexualize all physical contact because with our male friends, don't put your arm around him because that's gay, and don't put your arm around a woman that you're not in a relationship with because that's sexual harassing, and don't do this and don't do that. Some men end up not having physical contact with anybody for days at a time, but we take this, platonic touch is something that we lose all connection to, and all forms of touch are sexualized, and all forms of intimacy are sexualized. So what do men do? This deep need for connection, they go back to sex. And they're either bombarding their existing partner with this need that, are we going to have sex? Okay, we're having sex. Okay, when's the next time we're going to have sex? Mm-hmm. Because so much need gets bound up in that single idea. Or men are running around, going to bed with this woman, that woman, this woman, that woman, or this other man over and over and over again. Because of this absence, this hole in our lives which should have been filled with rich, warm relationships with men that are not. I'm not talking about going down to the bar and getting 5 beers and talking about the Oakland Athletics every single week. I'm talking about conversations where there's meaningful discussion of the challenges we face, of the ways that we're different, of what our fears and anxieties, as well as our joys. Like how do we get to go in and say, man, I'm so happy about this thing without other people either, calm down now, let's not get too excited.
It's funny, one of the skills that I teach my men is the skill of capitalizing, which is based on research out of UCLA, which is basically the idea that there's 4 different ways that we respond to another person's good news. And capitalizing is basically generating an enthusiastic and curious and genuine response to someone else's good news.
Beautiful.
Well, every guy that I talk to is like, that feels a lot like cheerleading. Like, that's not, like, I'm not comfortable with that. And it does. It feels weird at first, but it's also, it's a tremendous skill to begin to develop because it creates a positive upward spiral of emotions where you both benefit. Yeah. And to your point, I don't know how many of us can actually do that with other men. I was talking with Jed Diamond, who's written about 16 books. You know Jed, right?
I do.
And Jed, one of his firm beliefs is that every man needs to be in a men's group in order to have these kind of conversations that you're talking about. Because we just don't get those opportunities.
Well, you have to understand, man box culture is designed as a competitive, dominant, pecking order hierarchy. It's a pyramid scheme, and the top, 2%, all the power and all the influence and all the control flows up to them, and everybody else gets slotted in at whatever spot they warrant given their economic and their physical dominance and whatever it is. But this is not about cheering each other on. not by any stretch of the imagination. This is about staying dominant, staying controlling, staying powerful, and trying to own your piece on the ladder. But you can move up and down depending on your physical strength, depending on whatever it is.
Well, and Mark, can I jump in there real quick? Sorry to interrupt, but
please do.
One of the things that has become really apparent to me is, I think that most men buy into this pyramid thinking that if I can become that top 2%, then I'll be happy. Then I'll be fulfilled. And what I want to tell everyone out there listening is, I've worked with that top 2%, and I can tell you, they're not happy. And so I think once you have that realization that even if you were to get to the very upper echelon of this pyramid, there, unless we develop other skills, there's still no happiness. So if you're at all concerned about being happy and fulfilled in life, we got to find a different way.
Yeah, whatever your path is to happiness, I put most of it down to human connection. And if we take every natural capacity we have for human connection and stuff it and don't use it and hide it and are embarrassed about it and all the rest of it, then we're never going to form the kinds of connections, human connections, that give us community, that resource us during times of distress or challenge. This is the point. I think this is why some people find a strong religious community to be really useful, because it creates a semblance of that. But I think even in a church community, if you're still playing the man box role, you're not going to form the authentic connection you need. And the reason Jed Diamond talks about men's groups is because of this constant microaggression, pecking order, policing. I mean, we basically police and shame each other all our lives, right? And because of this, when you walk into a men's group, I'm an MKP brother, for instance, Mankind Project, but any men's group that's authentic and really trying to do the work, you'll have a certain experience. And the experience works like this. You walk in, and after about 10 minutes, you realize you no longer have to do the hierarchical bullying, threat tracking that would normally happen among any group of men who didn't know each other. I mean, you go into a bar, you meet a friend, he's got 5 other friends. Within a few minutes, everybody has figured out the pecking order, right? One guy gets to make fun of your basketball team, and you're going to let him because he seems to be a little more dominant, whatever, right? We do this game as men where we seem to think that insulting each other is a form of connection. And it's such, pardon my French, it's such bullshit, It's an isolating, ugly way to be a human being, but we're all taught that that's the way. Man, you're such an asshole. You're like, that's funny. Instead, you go to a men's group and you're no longer threat tracking. And it's like air comes into the room for the first time in your life, right? You begin to suddenly get this feeling that, oh, well, now I don't have to look for which guy's going to come after me. So instead, maybe I'll talk a little bit about my stuff. Maybe, okay, that's pretty good. I'll come back next week, whatever. But it's a powerful experience. They do a new warrior training weekend, and I went and did it. And frankly, I went into that experience. My particular narrative was that I didn't trust men, I didn't like men, I hated men, and I was sick to death of being alone. And
I think one of the rules that we develop or understandings is that men are going to hurt us.
Sure. Because they do. They do it constantly. And
one of the ways that I get around that, the whole put down and sarcasm culture that we're indoctrinated into in a big way in middle school and high school, that's kind of how we survive, I would argue, is by explaining to my clients that sarcasm is really, it's thinly veiled anger that you don't feel safe enough to say something. You don't feel safe enough to speak a truth, but you can get that truth out sarcastically because you can always hide behind the bit of, oh, well, I was just joking.
Right. How many times do we find ourselves saying, hey, man, I'm just kidding?
Yeah, it's kind of speaking truth to power.
Starting to get pissed off, yeah.
You can speak to the bigger guy who can kick your ass, and you can say something with sarcasm that you couldn't say otherwise.
So this man box culture thing, I mean, the book itself, the little Me Too book for men, it's 75 pages. It's very short, takes a couple hours to read. But what it attempts to do is help men do that thing where we start to see the difference between me and the culture that taught me how to be me, and begin to ask some really serious questions. And this relates to if we live in a culture where we police each other by denigrating women, then you have to ask yourself, if that was done to me, and it's really happens a lot when you're a boy and a young man. I mean, it's not weekly or daily; it's hourly.
Yeah.
It's a drumbeat of denigration of women that you really need to stop and ask yourself, how much of that has to happen in your life before it kind of programs you in really destructive ways toward women?
Well, and subtly, I mean, like I've even looked at the use of the word pussy as a put down. I mean, what is pussy? Pussy is a vagina. It's symbolic of the entirety of femininity. Mm-hmm. We're using that as one of the ultimate put downs. And I don't even think we stop to think about it at that level.
And fag, I mean, fag is I think culturally right now, a huge percentage of men no longer have an issue with homosexual sex. They don't have an issue with that. But fag, they still use that as a way to police each other's masculinity, right? And so we do these things and we don't even take a minute and sort of deconstruct culture, deconstruct and also, please, in the name of God, how's this all working out for you? Yeah. I mean, we're using all these mechanisms, we're doing them all the time, and we don't even like it all that much, right? Mm-hmm. We just think that's the only way.
I don't know any other way either. Like, I don't think there's another path. No one has really presented a path to say, here's a different way of being, here's a different way of experiencing life, here's a different way of communicating, a different way of connecting.
Well, I'll tell you, all the men I've met that are doing men's work are the way that they put their foot on the path was they said, I'm sick of being alone. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of not having any friends. I'm tired of this fucking game where I have to one-up everybody every day of my life. And my wife is literally saying to me, go out and find some friends. What are you doing, man? And I can't do it because the circle of men I'm involved with are all busy playing this same game. They're probably just as bloody lonely as I am, but nobody's going to step out of their fear space and connect, right? So I say to anybody here, go find a men's group. It is a good place to start. And what I also found was once I did the men's work and said, oh God, I'm breaking out of the man box. I'm stepping out of it. I began to find it's not all that goddamn scary to tell someone you know, I like you. Let's hang out more, man. I want to tell you some stuff about myself. Whatever. There's like this huge amount of fear that the boom's going to fall on us if we behave in those ways, if we connect more, if we are more genuinely affectionate to our friends. Yeah. But the fact is, it's an illusion. It's not real. People actually respond positively.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think there is some fear about opening up and sharing. I mean, I remember when I was doing a radio show about 10 years ago, and I thought, gee, I got to share with the listeners that part of my makeup's a little bit of depression, part of it's a little bit of anxiety, that I feel things deeply. And I was scared shitless to do that because I thought for sure I would get hammered afterwards. Mm-hmm. You know what happened?
What?
Nothing. Nothing. I got some compliments.
Yeah, I heard it said that when we are vulnerable and share parts of ourselves, especially in a more public setting, we tend to walk away thinking, oh, what did I just do? I'm an idiot. And then people walk up to us and they go, that was so meaningful. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and there was a study that they looked at vulnerability recently where they had people get up on stage and share something personal in front of a crowd. Yeah. And then they interviewed them to see how they felt. And afterwards, the person doing the speaking was embarrassed, probably a little bit ashamed. Like they thought, oh my God, what was I thinking? Like, why did I do that? So a lot of regret. And then they checked with people in the crowd, and the people in the crowd were like, wow, that was so courageous. Like, I'm so impressed with that person.
That's a powerful human being. Right.
And, wow, the courage that took to share that. So I think part of it is understanding there's a disconnect between how we perceive it ourselves from the inside and how others perceive it from the outside in.
Well, right. And for most of those people, it was probably not something they did very often. But when you get used to sharing who you are, you gain this sort of emotional stamina, right? You're able to be in that space. You're no longer easily shamed about it. You begin to use it more. And it's a muscle like any other. Connection, authentic connection, is a capacity which, if not used, atrophies. But it's like any other muscle. If you start using it, you'll grow, it'll get stronger, it'll become something you're more fluid in, all of that.
Well, I think it's a way to let the pressure out, too. I mean, it's,
please.
Our stress response as males is fight, flight, freeze. Women, it's tend and befriend. So women biologically have this predisposition to go seek out others and socialize when they're stressed out.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to isolate.
Right. Well, I would say that's socially conditioned into us.
Well, I think there's it could be. I don't know the origin.
I think we get punished when we look for help as kids.
True.
But if you may be right, it may be partially biological, whatever it is.
My guess is there's a little bit of both in there, but in other words, as we learn to communicate more, to open up more, the benefits are enormous in terms of keeping our mental health intact and dealing with stress.
Right. And the thing that's also really traumatizing about man box culture is that there is no mechanism by which when we cut boys off from expressing in authentic ways and doing that kind of connection. I mean, basically, when you tell a boy, don't show your emotions, it is in the process of relating. It's in back and forth of relationships that emotions emerge. Mm-hmm. If you're standing around in a desert somewhere by yourself for 30 years, you don't have these things emerge when you're in a relationship with someone else. They don't happen in isolation. And even the emotions we feel when we're alone are coming out of conversations we remember and experiences with others that we remember from earlier. But if you tell a boy, don't show your emotions, what you're essentially saying is do not engage in the forming and maintaining of relationships. So men do this relationships of proximity, this surface performance of connection. And you say, well, who are your friends? And the guy says, oh yeah, the guys down at the gym, they're my buddies, But if you change gym, you just drop all those guys and pick up the ones at the next gym because men are all the same, right?
Well, we have surface level connections with them. But, and to go back to your earlier comment, so it was interesting. I was talking with Dr. Faith Harper recently, who wrote the book Unfuck Your Brain, which is a #1 bestseller, fiction, great book. But she's a trauma psychologist. Mm-hmm. And it made me really think about, okay, if trauma doesn't necessarily have to be something dramatic, like it doesn't have to be going to the Gulf War and, seeing dead bodies and experiencing bombs going off. It can be minor if it's more repetitive.
Oh, yeah.
And it made me think, like how many of us men have been to some degree traumatized simply through the socialization process of how we're brought up?
Well, Niobe Way says that, when you tell a boy, don't show your emotions, what you're essentially saying to him is be invulnerable. Mm-hmm. Be invulnerable, appear invulnerable. That is traumatizing because you never again to speak fear or sadness or any. To me, I see that pattern. If the microaggressions are happening every day, and sometimes it's not a microaggression, it's getting your ass kicked.
Yeah, it's an aggression.
And this fear of that outcome, every day you're tracking all these other kids at the school trying to make sure you don't get cornered in the gym lockers or whatever.
Yeah.
That is traumatizing, absolutely.
Well, and I have, clients that used to walk home through the streets of Oakland, and if they didn't get beat up every day, they were worried about getting beaten up every day. And, so then it fascinates me because some of the ways that trauma can play out are depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, even psychosis.
Sure.
And so there's some real serious consequences to this trauma, but even if it, merely hypersensitizes our amygdala and our emotional response system so that we're super easily triggered into that fight, flight, freeze response, well, what is that? That's fear, anger, and sadness.
Yeah.
So, if we get flooded really easily because of this early trauma, that seems to match a lot of the men that I know.
Right. And how much stuff that could be taken either way, could be framed in different ways. We see it all as threat because we're tracking threats, right? So every gesture by another man, potentially a threat. Every opportunity, I see the downside. All that stuff where we're constantly looking for the next ass whipping because that stuff, when you threat track over a period of years, and I don't know about some men, maybe some men had a cakewalk through junior high school and high school. I don't know. But for me, it was serious threat tracking. And when you threat track for years and years and years, you create these grooves in your way of seeing the world and in your neurological structures where that's what you're tracking. And we look for failure in so many different ways as men. We look for the worst case scenario, and then we get ready for it, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for a lot of us, right?
Well, and I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, if we seek to control the world by dominating, if that's the best threat response we can think of, you're going to throw a punch in a minute, so I'm throwing mine first.
Yeah.
Always. Yeah.
Well, and I think that, for us, for men in general, a lot of it comes down to control, as you were mentioning, and underneath the control is fear. And I would say that underneath the fear is, to a large extent, there's a worry about being embarrassed or humiliated. Mm-hmm. That, we don't want to appear out of control. We don't want to appear in any way like we don't know what we're doing. And so we're constantly wearing this mask, and the mask is a facade. I mean, we're posing.
But what does that create in terms of our abilities to collaborate, co-create, see what emerges, all the sort of processes by which we take in other people's ideas, share ours, move around, come up with something new. These ways of being creative in design, in industry, and in any sort of a business context gets lost because men are trained from day one to appear like they already have the answer. Mm-hmm. Men, I was told recently, a guy changed his whole business career the first time he sat in a meeting and said, I don't know the answer. And he's the leader of the team, right? I don't know the answer. We're going to have to go find it together. We're going to have to work collaboratively, bring our ideas. And before that, he always felt obligated to provide it. It's awful. It's an awful place to be. If I have to look like I know what I'm doing all the time, it's exhausting.
Well, and I can't tell you how many clients I've talked to where I'm trying to, explain a new concept to them, like self-compassion, which is foreign to every man that I've talked to. And so many of them will be like, I'll start to explain it. I'll get a sentence or two into a 5-minute talk. And they'll be like, oh, I know. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, dude, understand that by doing that, by having that response, you are shutting down your intake of new information, and you are essentially killing any chance you have of evolving.
Right.
So first step, you got to shut up. You got to stop saying, I know.
Yeah. I know what you're going to say. Know. Yeah. And
so it's fascinating to me. So I see that a lot, that dynamic of I know, I got it. Like, I don't want to appear stupid. I don't want to appear as if I don't know.
I was talking, I wrote an article a while back called Mansplaining 101. And mansplaining is an example of identity-based language, which is triggering for men. Toxic masculinity is a term I do not use. Mansplaining is a term I do not use. These are terms which can be taken to be a critique of identity, and I want to make bloody damn sure that men understand that it's the culture we're talking about, and the culture is where the problem lies. And culture, unlike identity, is maintained or changed by men and women together. So there is a certain population of women that is required to keep man box culture going. And they do, in fact, enforce it and teach it to their sons and believe in it. So if we're going to talk to men about masculinity, we cannot have a conversation that precludes women, but also we cannot let women off the hook for man box culture because some percentage of them are driving that with their own children. But ultimately, this question of how men arrive at identity. I wrote this book on mansplaining, and what was painfully evident to me is that boys and men, because we don't have authentic connections, tell me about your life, your stories, your background, your worries, your fears. We instead talk about common interests, right? Cars or sports or whatever. And then what's the very next thing we do? Oh yeah, you like Chryslers? Mopar, huh? Hey, did you see that 357 Hemi? Yeah, well, that's a 4.5 liter. And we immediately begin in proving our competency in that area. So not only do I tell you what our common interest is, then we quickly do a pecking order thing. Who knows more? Mm-hmm. So men are taught to connect through levels of knowledge and competency in their common areas. And we turn around then and try that with women, and it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. But we've been taught all our lives that no, you're not gonna have that emotional connection. You're instead gonna do this thing where you prove you know. And for men, the big shaming moment is when they don't know. Oh, you don't know about that new engine which got the lifters and the cams and this and that? Well, then you're an idiot, man. And you're like, oh, God, yeah, I am. Well, why we do that to each other, I cannot imagine, because a much more interesting life is when you say, no, I don't know about that. Tell me about it. I'd love to learn. I don't know. And in relationship with women, when we try to bring all that competency, oh, yeah, you're an engineer. Well, let me tell you what I know about engineering, blah, 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 blah. And they're like, why do you have to act like you know about this? I have a master's in it.
It's funny. There's a principle in psychology that talks about how the level of intelligence that you have is often tied up to the level of confidence that you have in your knowledge base. People that are closer to the midpoint, the 50th percentile of the IQ bell curve, many of them are highly confident in their knowledge base, even though much of their knowledge is wrong. Whereas people towards the 95th percentile and above of IQ are not very confident in their knowledge base, often because they're aware of how much there is out there that they don't know.
And how much is going to be proven wrong tomorrow.
Right.
I mean, we have to understand that everything we are and everything we hope to do, both personally and professionally, is born out of relationships with others. And that includes how good our knowledge base is, right? And you're never going to get a better knowledge base if all you do is tell what you already know.
Well, and it's interesting, you bring up the importance of relationships. And I remember having that epiphany some years ago. And I was like, oh man, like relationships are a foundational pillar of happiness.
Yeah.
Shit. Like, now I gotta.
Oh my God.
And I was kind of pissed. I was like,
so bad at that.
Damn, oh man, like, now I gotta get better in a relationship. Son of a bitch.
That stuff's impossible, and I've never learned how to do it. Right.
Well, I got years of practice ahead of me.
Yeah. It's like, oh, I have to learn to play the piccolo. Great. But honestly, children can be raised to grow these relational capacities.
Yes.
And they naturally engage and work with it. And if we stay in conversation with them and encourage their capacity to express emotionally, I mean, when any baby, a small child first expresses emotionally, it's usually a pretty loud sound, right? And that's how they start out. But over time, it becomes more nuanced, and they begin to take context into consideration, and they understand that, oh, that person's going to hear me if I speak quietly. That one, I got to make a little more noise. But if we cut them off from that trial and error process over time, then when they are adults and they express emotionally, it's still going to be, it's still going to be this loud sound that is essentially offensive to the people around us. So we owe it to ourselves whenever we're ready to start developing a nuanced understanding of how to express.
Yeah, and to take that a step further, I mean, if you think about differentiation of different emotions, and the more we're in relationship, more trial and error, the better we get at it. There was a study a while back that showed that on average, males can name about 8 emotions or identify about 8 emotions. Females, it's about 17.
Wow. Well, I'm slightly troubled by that. I'm mildly disconcerted. I
like to think of it as motivating. It's motivating. Holy shit! Okay, I challenge you to
I was going to try to name a couple of emotions there, but I failed.
And by the way, that's an approach I take with men a lot. I challenge you because we like that challenge. We respond well to it.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, all right, I'm going to prove you wrong. I'll show you. It's an easy motivator.
Yeah. Well, that's the men are used to hierarchical structures, and hierarchical structures are useful, I suppose, in combat or fighting fires or whatnot. But even in combat these days, there's a lot of interpersonal skills that they're trying to teach to officers, because you have to engage with the local population. You have to do all this other stuff.
Right.
And ultimately, if we want our sons to succeed in the world, we have to acknowledge these relational capacities as being equally important to all the traditional masculine capacities that we seem to so easily support in our boys. And I think men are doing a lot more innovative stuff with daughters than they're doing with their sons still. Mm-hmm. I think that's
a great point. Because
that's just sad.
With my daughter, I mean, with my daughters, where I could say, wow, I really like your toughness there. Kind of shake off that pain when they fall down playing soccer.
Yeah.
And encouraging them to be assertive,
sure,
appropriately. And then, with my sons, I could validate their emotions. I wanted them to be comfortable feeling. But to your point, I never said something like, wow, I really like the way that you spoke up to your friend there and asserted yourself. I really liked the way that you put your arm around your friend when he was sad and supported him. Like, those affirmations weren't there.
Well, and ask them what they're seeing. What did you see in that moment? And how do you think they deal with that emotion at his house? You know, you get them to begin sort of considering the complexity of human relationships in those moments. Well, that's also, really where boys need to go.
When they're young, even helping them to identify what they're feeling, because often as their parent, you can tell by facial expression, body language, what they're feeling, and say, gee, it seems like you're feeling upset right now, or angry, or sad.
Yeah.
Is that your experience, or is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's helpful to help them put the right emotional label on it.
Well, and you model your emotions, don't hide them. Your kid sees you being emotional, and your kid may even see you being emotional in a bad way. But then he gets to see how you make up for that, how you connect again, how you say, hey, I didn't handle that very well. I had a whole thing with my kid where we talked to him about this idea of collapsing into other people's emotions, right? And men never get any practice on how to avoid that. So if you do mad, I do mad, right? I immediately react, you know.
Emotions are contagious.
Right, right. Whereas we used to talk to my son all the time about, look, if someone's feeling this way on the playground or in your family or whatever, sure, you want to match that, you want to mirror what they're doing. That's a choice. Mm-hmm. You can also choose to wait a second and try to figure out what's going on there, right? And even wait a little longer so that whatever your response is from a different place emotionally. So my son and my wife and I are stepping off the curb in New York, and he's about 9. And I'm having one of those days, and I'm feeling kind of, and so I just say to them, I don't even know why, but I'm just having a bad day. I'm just having a really bad day. And my son looks around and he says, well, Dad, that's fine. And you go ahead and feel that way. But Saliha and I, we're not getting on that train. and I'm like, good, don't get on that train. I appreciate it. It's my train. I'm going to ride this train. But what happens in that moment is you realize you just liberated your son from that automatic sort of reactive engagement when we go out in the world, so many of us as men are just time bombs walking around that anybody can set off. I'm going to pick you may be the biggest, strongest guy in the world, but guess what I'm going to do? In 2 words, I'm going to pick your emotion for you because you're so reactive, right? Yep. So he says, we're going on, and they're smiling and talking. And by the time I got my foot on the next curb, I realized 2 things had happened. One, I was eternally grateful to be able to feel crappy, but not have it ruin other people's day because we'd already talked through this. But another block down the street, and I felt my mood lifting because I was able to share it, right? Yep. And we as men feel like we can't show this to anybody because it'll ruin their day, quote unquote. But also, when somebody comes up and comes in our face with something, we just give it to them. It's like, here, have a gift. Take over my whole goddamn life for the next 5 minutes. And that, to me, is power. That's real power, right?
Yeah, I like the idea of that. If you're not aware of the emotional contagion dynamic, then it's sort of like me giving you the remote control to my emotions.
Oh, yeah.
Here, push any button you want.
Yeah, push them up. Push them as many times as you like. Yeah. And we do this in our marriages.
We're just giving away our power.
We do this in our daily lives with people we live with. We do this. And oh my God, it's like, and people wonder why they end up in shouting matches and getting divorced. It's because they haven't ever thought of the possibility of maybe I don't have to do the emotion that's being shown to me. Yeah. And we have a thing with our son and in our family where anybody can raise their hand and say, I'm taking 5 minutes. This is getting too heated.
Yeah, critical.
I'm just going to walk out of the room. And it's not seen as abandoning the other people.
Or disrespectful.
It's seen as supporting the other people. And when you come back,
I can't tell you how many, I've done anger management for some time in the past. And inevitably, when I'm working with someone in a family to manage their anger and stay calmer in these conflicts, the other person at first will elevate the intensity of their anger because I think there's this subconscious need to
draw that response out in you.
I'm going at you until I trigger your anger so you match my intensity.
Yes, yes.
I'm mad now that you're staying calm.
That's even worse. Yeah. No,
now you're pointing out how foolish I look when I'm getting mad.
Right. And ultimately, anger can become something positive. If we help our sons or daughters get used to the expression of emotions, one of them is going to be anger. If we are able to help them nuance and understand Okay, well, let's nuance it this way. Where do you think it's coming from? Oh, yeah? What if it's coming from something else? You can have that conversation. Or you can say, yeah, I see that you're angry and I acknowledge it. And I think it's fine that you're angry. That's a whole different experience. Because men, when we do, I mean, in the world of man box culture, the theory is that men are allowed to show anger. That's the emotion we are allowed to show. But ultimately, I came to the conclusion pretty quickly that in my life, that whenever I get angry, I lose. Because
and I think
immediately people would say, aha, see, you're an angry man.
To me, it goes back to Aristotle, who said that the hardest thing to do is to get angry at the right person at the right time, to the right degree, in the right manner. And I think that we can use anger as men, but we're really unskillful at it.
Oh, yeah.
And, to me, anger is meant to be brought up when your needs aren't being met or when someone crosses a boundary and violates in your life.
Yeah.
And the idea is to learn to speak up for your needs. I need you to speak to me respectfully, or I need you to give me some space, whatever it is. But as men, I think we're taught or we learn not to speak up for our needs because we maybe don't know what the needs are, or we're afraid they're not going to be met, or we're afraid we're going to be embarrassed, or any number of reasons. But one of the skills that I work on with a lot of men is identifying what it is they need in the moment, and then being able to speak up and assert themselves and say, this is what I need right now.
Yeah, that's great. Well, imagine if you go through life cut off from learning in the trial and error of over decades to understand what you're feeling and communicate it in nuanced ways. You may find yourself going to anger as a way to shut down conversations because, guess what? Your wife wasn't under that prohibition, or your girlfriend wasn't under that prohibition, or your male partner may be more nuanced, and suddenly they're running circles around you in an emotional conversation, and you panic and throw the anger button to shut it down, right?
Well, the other thing that's interesting along this topic is that one of the things I see in a lot of the men that I work with is with anger, the dynamic is that when you're really angry, you're externalizing all blame for whatever the issue is.
Amen.
So when I'm angry with you, it's all your fault. It's not my fault, right? I don't need to learn anything. I don't need to do anything differently. You do. Right. If you would just change, I would be less angry. That's typically the dynamic. And the problem with that is that it keeps us men from learning.
Right.
It destroys curiosity.
It also implies
it's
that
so easy to stay stuck in that anger dynamic and keep going back to it, and then nothing's our fault, and we don't need to learn any new skills.
Well, and it's like saying this thing that made me mad is absolutely a single isolated phenomenon floating in the great cosmos. Bullshit. Everything's tied to what came before that, became before that, came before that, came before that, came before that, till the first moment that we engaged with that person socially on some level. And we are co-creating the dynamics of our relationships every single minute of every single day. And we can shift it just as easily as we can maintain it. But the idea that some event isn't tied to a whole bunch of history prior to that and doesn't spin out into a whole bunch of future events, this is serious business, right? And when we throw down on anger, we're absolutely refusing to acknowledge our part in it.
Yeah, and I like the idea of the metaphor. I teach this metaphor to clients that, we have two buckets of emotion. One's positive, one's negative. And even that languaging is a little bit clumsy because all emotions serve a purpose, but just to stay with me. So you got this bucket of positive emotions. Think of it on a 1 to 10 scale. You got a bucket of negative emotions. And there's this gradual accumulation of negative emotions, generally, just drips of annoyance, irritation, frustration, sadness, rejection, and fear. And we normally focus on that bucket. And we're normally focusing on how do we empty that bucket out.
Right.
And then we kind of ignore the bucket of positive emotions, but the bucket of positive emotions has a whole host of benefits to it as well. And so if you take that, I think we all have an emotional profile where we stay pretty consistently at that level. Like, let's say I'm at a 5 of negative emotions and a 2 of positive emotions, something like that. And then if you consider that every relationship in your life, you've got a similar set of buckets, but they're at a different level based on whatever has gone before in that relationship. So I deal with, like, I don't know, an adult male businessman who has a teenage son. And he's really frustrated with the teenage son for past behaviors. So his negative bucket is at a 9 almost all the time. And the positive bucket's like at a 1 or a 2. So you can imagine when you go into an interaction with that profile, that it's probably not going to go very well. So we need to do some work to empty out the negative bucket, fill up the positive bucket, to give that relationship to give them a new way of interacting.
Right.
Jumping
right.
off.
What a terrible thing and I've been through this in my own life. I have been divorced. To go into a relationship that you realize has gone beyond the point of being easily redeemed, even with hard work over time, difficult to redeem. And I think the problem for us is that we often view much of our emotional challenges as somehow being rooted in our childhoods or rooted in a past history of challenges or whatever they are, when in fact much of what we can do to create change in our life is by simply understanding the massive degree of agency we have in the relationships, in the relational space, right? We call it a relational space in the work that we do. I've written a book, The Relational Book for Parenting, which includes ways to grow relational capacities in our kids. Saliha and I wrote that. But the idea that, there it is. What do you know? And
product placement.
Right. Well, that book talks about this idea of a relational space. And we have that with anyone we're in a relationship with. And if we look at that as the malleable, interesting, playful, curious place that it really is, or we can look at it as, I know exactly how that's going to go, and I know how that's going to get off the rails right away. I understand how crappy that thing is. Then that's our choice. It's a choice we're making. Yep. But any relational space can be revitalized and changed and shifted with some fairly straightforward choices on our part as adults. One example with that. Oh, go ahead. No, you go.
I was going to say the first choice, I think, is to decide that you're going to enter into the relationship or that interaction that day with compassion and curiosity.
Absolutely. Curiosity is a powerful word. We have a thing in the Relational Book called listening with curiosity. And you may be married to somebody for 10 years and you think you know them inside and out, which of course is illusory because they've been changing for 10 years. So they're constantly evolving. But we get into this thing where we're like, okay, I married her. Now I know her. And so 10 years later, you think, I pretty much know how she's going to respond to whatever, but I have this thing I have to talk about with her. So I'm going to go talk to her. But in the process of doing that, I'm going to bring all these stories I have about her and all these predictions. And so any conversation, even if you're just 10 exchanges in, is going to have let's say it has, 10 different threads, right? But if this thread right here is the one I expected, and the one I'm listening for, and yep, there it is again, then that's the way the conversation is going to go, because I'm going to follow that thread. And I'm going to ignore all these other threads. But if I say, okay, I'm going into this conversation, and I'm intentionally going to listen with curiosity, which means I'm going to expect to be surprised. I'm going to expect to hear things I don't know are going to happen. And then when I see them, I'm going to mark them and ask about them, right? So you can do this.
Questions, I think, is
Well, you can do this in a business relationship and anywhere you want. But if you say, well, what was that thing you said over there? I've never heard you say that before. That's new. Tell me more about that. Then that conversation is going to move down a different branch, and some new possibilities and options are going to open up. And you got 9 other possible branches there. So listening with curiosity is a really powerful way to find a new path forward with someone who you think you can predict what they're going to do or be. God knows, we get married and we think, I know that person. And 10 years later, they've gone off over the hill and down into the valley. And we're still looking at the spot where they used to be and thinking, I don't know my wife anymore. Well, she's not even there anymore. Why don't you go find her? Yeah. Because she's growing. And by the way, you're growing and changing too. It's a fascinating process.
Well, Mark, I get the impression that we could keep talking here for hours.
I know, it's bad, isn't it?
and maybe there's another interview here down the road, which I would love to do, because I love the conversations with you. They're endlessly stimulating. Is there anything that you would like to add before we wrap up? Any websites or social media that you want to put out there?
Well, I will say this first. I appreciate the fact that you just let me ramble on. You've literally had to go, Mr. Greene, could you excuse me? I'd just like to say something on my own podcast. I'm like, I get so excited. I just stumble down these trails of words. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And if anybody would like to learn more about the books, the Little Me Too book for men or the Relational Book for parenting, you can come find me on my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Remaking Manhood. Remaking Manhood is pretty much my Twitter handle. It's Instagram. And then we have a website, Saliha and I, called Think Play Partners.
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. As I said, I greatly enjoy these conversations. I think these are immensely valuable for the listeners. And hopefully we can make a little bit of a dent in this man box culture. That would be the biggest win of all.
Fantastic. I agree completely. Thank you for your time, too.
All right.
All right. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Evolved Caveman podcast. If you like what you've heard, support us by subscribing, leaving reviews, and sharing the podcast with friends and colleagues. For the latest, most powerful tools to connect with like-minded men, join the Facebook group at The Evolved Caveman. Follow Dr. John on Instagram at The Evolved Caveman, all one word, or join the email list by visiting guidetoself.com.